Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, we have a new Prime Minister. Just an hour ago, Theresa May arrived in Downing Street after her meeting with the Queen and stood in front of that famous black front door with her husband, Philip, to address the nation as Prime Minister for the first time. She said her government would forge a bold and positive role for the country in the world and lead a government that works not for the privileged, but for everyone. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Downing Street. You're in front of that famous front door now, and inside, what's she doing now?
There is a bit of routine to this when a new Prime Minister comes in, so we actually know. We even have an image of the very first thing that happens, because Theresa May, as is traditional, was clapped into the building by the staff. She is then taken to a room just straight down the corridor there, where she meets the Chief of the Defence Staff. He explains the Trident nuclear missile system to her. The Cabinet Secretary, Sir Jeremy Hayward, then tells her to write 4 letters, which will go into the safe of each of the 4 Trident submarines. In the event of government here being wiped out of a nuclear attack, the instructions there for the submarine commander to know what to do with the missiles. So she starts with some very heavy stuff. Then, by tradition, there's a phone call to the President of the United States, which they try to book in, and then it's straight down to the business of forming a team. And we have already seen, just in the last few minutes, Philip Hammond going in, the current Foreign Secretary, but an awful lot of people think, probably within a few minutes or so, maybe even as we speak now, being told that he's the Chancellor.
An intriguing speech outside that front door. Is that going to tell us something of the way she's going to govern?
I think it was. It was very focused on social justice, and it kind of tells you that Theresa May interprets that Brexit vote not just as an instruction to get on with Brexit, whatever that means, and it could mean an awful lot of different things. There is a very wide range of possible definitions, but also she sees it as some kind of revolt against the elites, a feeling amongst people who are disadvantaged or who are striving that this country, this government doesn't really work for them. So she was trying to get that point across, but it'll be, of course, difficult. Many people have made similar sermons as they go into number 10. It's very difficult to deliver on that. Anyway, on the day that power changed hands in this country, here's how it went.
Theresa May's car swept in the gates of Buckingham Palace 32 seconds after David Cameron's had driven out the same entrance. At a time of much chaos in British public life, a bit of reassuring precision. At around 5:30 this afternoon, with a low curtsy, Theresa May met the Queen and took office as Prime Minister. Britain's 54th Prime Minister then drove back to Downing Street with her husband, Philip. In front of her new home, she promised her government would be dedicated to social justice.
If you're from an ordinary working-class family, life is much harder than many people in Westminster realise. You have a job, but you don't always have job security. You have your own home, but you worry about paying the mortgage. You can just about manage, but you worry about the cost of living and getting your kids into a good school. If you're one of those families, if you're just managing, I want to address you directly. When we take the big calls, we'll think not of the powerful, but you. When we pass new laws, we'll listen not to the mighty, but to you. When it comes to taxes, we'll prioritise not the wealthy, but you. When it comes to opportunity, we won't entrench the advantages of the fortunate few. We will do everything we can to help anybody, whatever your background, to go as far as your talents will take you. We are living through an important moment in our country's history. Following the referendum, we face a time of great national change. And I know, because we're Great Britain, that we will rise to the challenge. As we leave the European Union, we will forge a bold, new, positive role for ourselves in the world. And together, we will build a better Britain.
Her short speech conveyed a sense that the referendum was not just about Europe, but a revolt against the elites who've had it too much their own way. Theresa May must now try to deliver something that satisfies those who are disadvantaged and those who just manage. Earlier, David Cameron went to the Commons for his last Prime Minister's questions. Watched from the public gallery by his wife and children, he was cheered to his seat by Tory MPs. He congratulated Theresa May and mocked Labour.
First of all, let me say at the dispatch box how warmly I congratulate the Home Secretary on becoming leader of the Conservative Party. And when it comes to women Prime Ministers, I'm very pleased to be able to say pretty soon it's going to be 2-0.
Even in his darkest hour, the colossal failure of losing the EU referendum, tipping him out of office. The state of the Labour Party in total disarray gave David Cameron political cover.
Let's just take the last week. We both have been having these leadership elections. We got on with it. We've had resignation, nomination, competition and coronation. They haven't even decided what the rules are yet.
Jeremy Corbyn recalled David Cameron saying that his mother thought the Labour leader should smarten up his appearance.
I'd also like him to pass on my thanks to his mum for her advice about ties in suits and songs. It's extremely kind of her, and I'd be grateful if he'd pass that on to her personally.
I will certainly send his good wishes back to my mother. He seems to have taken her advice and is looking absolutely splendid today. But it gives me...
Prime Minister's legacy will...
Yes, MP's Angus Robertson said his party's MPs could not applaud David Cameron because he'd taken Britain out of the EU. David Cameron came back with advice for Theresa May, looking on at his side, her face inscrutable.
My advice to my successor, who is a brilliant negotiator, is that we should try to be as close to the European Union as we can be for the benefits of trade, of cooperation and of security.
How closely she follows his advice is one of the central questions facing the country. Now he's just a backbench MP.
The last thing I'd say is that you can achieve a lot of things in politics. You can get a lot of things done. And that, in the end, the public service, the national interest, that is what it's all about. Nothing is really impossible if you put your mind to it. After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
Tory MPs stood to clap. Most of the opposition stayed in their seats, clapping. Theresa May said to David Cameron, "Look at the public gallery." There was an unprecedented standing ovation happening in the visitors' area, so he waved at them. He'd been a winner for his party, taking them twice into office, but he would be remembered as someone who gambled and lost in the referendum on Europe. Then the whole family went back inside the house. They're leaving 9 weeks earlier than they expected on Monday morning. Just over 2 hours ago, he emerged with his family, long kept away from the cameras, to say thank you.
I want to thank my children, Nancy, Elwyn and Florence, for whom Downing Street has been a lovely home over these last 6 years. They sometimes kick the red boxes full of work. Florence, you once climbed into one before a foreign trip and said, "Take me with you." Well, no more boxes. And above all, I want to thank Samantha, the love of my life. You have kept me vaguely sane, and as well as being an amazing wife, mother and businesswoman, you have done something every week in that building behind me to celebrate the best of voluntary service in our country. We will shortly be heading to Buckingham Palace to see Her Majesty the Queen, where I'll tender my resignation as Prime Minister, and I would advise Her Majesty to invite Theresa May to form a new administration. I'm delighted that for the second time in British history, the new Prime Minister will be a woman, and once again a Conservative. I believe Theresa will provide strong and stable leadership in fulfilling the Conservative manifesto on which we were elected, and I wish her well in negotiating the best possible terms for Britain's exit from the European Union. And as we leave for the last time, my only wish is continued success for this great country that I love so very much. Thank you.
There was a last group photo and then a group hug to steady the nerves before it was off to Buckingham Palace to resign his office. The family came too. Less than 3 weeks ago, They thought they had 3 or 4 more years in Downing Street. But that was before Britain voted for Brexit. That word now his epitaph. He'd warned us it would be a calamity. For many it is a scary journey. And it happened on his watch.
Well, there's a real sense of moment here in Westminster, a feeling of expectation amid all the ceremonial, the comings and goings to the palace, lots of ministers wondering what the future holds for them, and onlookers just curious about how the new Prime Minister will govern Britain. Well, joining me now is Conservative grandee Ken Clarke. Thanks very much for joining us. You said in the Commons today, no two people know what Brexit means. So really, Theresa May is going through that door in number 10, stepping into the unknown, isn't she?
That's the first of the big problems she's got to tackle, because we know we're going to leave, but no two campaigners on the Brexit side actually agree with each other about exactly what that means. So, and we don't have a government, so we've got to have a government. It has no policy on how to Brexit. She's got to get together a good government that will hold together, start work on putting together a package of things we want to negotiate. The rest of Europe's waiting to be told by the British what it is they now want to start talking about.
Well, you said she was a bloody difficult woman. I mean, she's going to need to be as difficult, if not more difficult, than Thatcher when it comes to negotiating with
Well,
the
I
EU.
compared her with Thatcher. I did say she was good, and I said I usually get on with her. Yeah, she's got the right temperament. I think the very fact that she's not flamboyant, she's not going to try doing the sound bites and all the rest of it. She can do the photo opportunities, but, you know, she's actually extremely pragmatic, hard-working, sensible woman, and the fact that her temperament isn't in the sort of Blairite, even the David Cameron mould, is probably what we need right now. What she'll want to know is what is the best thing to do and how is she going to deliver it. Now, that matter-of-fact approach to going about the job is certainly going to be needed. She's got a tough job on the next few months.
Well, you talk about putting together the government, which is obviously what she's engaged in now. We've seen Philip Hammond and Boris Johnson going into number 10. What do you think the future might hold for them?
Well, you always go to a reshuffle, not quite sure, and so I have no idea. My experience in the past is Prime Ministers always begin with the senior people they're disappointing. You know, you get called in early, you're going to be sacked. After that, you're being moved about or promoted. So, as I know nothing against Philip or Boris, we shall wait and see.
Do you think she should include Boris in
No,
the
well, the
government?
other thing about Theresa is she knows her own mind. I mean, when I say she's a bloody difficult woman, which she can be stubborn and difficult when she knows her own mind. So can I, I'm sometimes told. And she will have very clear views of who she wants. She'll appoint on merit. She has to promote Brexiteers. She needs a good mix of Brexiteers and Leavers, credible ones. She'll also appoint a lot of women, because she's one of the most absolutely fervent feminists I know, and that's a compliment in my book, and she'll bring a lot more, even more women in, I think.
What about David Cameron? I mean, you know, he called this referendum. He will be defined by that, won't he? Should he have ever called it?
Well, not in my opinion, obviously, no. I think it was a reckless decision, and sadly, in my opinion, it's proved to be so. And he is slightly cursed with the fact that I think people remember the Cameron government when he did a lot of other good things. They'll say, oh, that's the guy who accidentally took us out of Europe by calling a referendum. I've just been taking part in the Chilcot debate, and Tony Blair did some good things, but people will look back at the Blair government and say, oh, the man who went into Iraq.
And in the pantheon of prime ministers, how will David Cameron be regarded?
Oh, David Cameron was pretty good. I mean, he had leadership quality, he had flair, he's also a decent member of the human race, as we saw today. When he's relaxing, he can be very amusing, and Theresa can as well, but not quite in the same way.
We don't always see that. Well, Ken Clarke, thank you very much for joining us. Well, David Cameron had very clear ideas about how he'd like to be remembered, listing the changes he made as Prime Minister in his valedictory speech. He singled out higher employment and the introduction of the national living wage, protecting the foreign aid budget and legalising same-sex marriage. But others will remember instead his slashing of disability benefits and the rise of food banks. Our social affairs correspondent Jackie Long has been speaking to the people affected, for better or for worse, by his time in office. And just to warn you, there is flash photography in this report.
A personal moment, but a very political one too. Nathan Taylor and Ben Till were one of the very first gay couples to get married, just hours after it became legal more than 2 years ago.
Suddenly we have this legality. We're allowed to be in love. We're allowed to. If I want to walk down the street, I don't want to walk down the street holding hands with my husband, but if I did...
No offence.
Yeah, I'm right here, you know. people wouldn't be able to judge me for doing that. And if they
did, we could say, you know what?
Yeah.
This means that you don't have a say in this anymore.
Yeah.
The couple, no fans of Mr Cameron, accept he played his part in delivering equal marriage, but that it is not his legacy alone.
Lots of people might say, well, you're a bit churlish not to give him this one as part of his legacy.
Do you know what? Possibly, and I would admit that. I just think if you look at the history of the Conservative Party when it comes to equal rights, it's difficult to erase all of that just because one man decided to support someone else's initiative.
He led from the front in introducing gay marriage against much opposition, and the consequence of that is that 30,000 gay couples have been able to get married as a result of that reform. I'm very proud of it and very proud of the role that he played.
This party does care about the weak, about the poor, about the vulnerable, about the dispossessed and those who...
It was a new kind of Conservative party he promised. Social reform, a key plank of his vision. He promised to hug a hoodie while the hoodies gave him the finger, and many in his own party despaired of a liberal agenda they hated. His idea for a big society stumbled. Critics said its inevitable conclusion, longer queues at burgeoning food banks. And austerity took its toll, with many saying his cuts turned the clock back for some of the most vulnerable.
In Manchester there's no support outside the house, there's no support to get your washing done, there's no support to help tidy your house, do your food shopping. All the basic requirements aren't met, beyond even being able to start to have a chance of a quality of life, any colour of life, you know, any independence. We're fighting for our basic human rights.
But his term as Prime Minister saw employment rise to record levels and a new national living wage introduced. His supporters confident he delivered on his pledge to reform.
He's presided over a compassionate conservatism, but also one that ensured that we had the economic strength to stand by things like supporting the National Health Service. I'm proud of David Cameron's record.
I am now very happy to announce that you are now legally...
So while the former Prime Minister may hope that bringing people together will be how history remembers his leadership, he knows it's the splitting of one union which will be the thing no one will ever forget.
Jackie Long, news breaking in Downing Street. The Right Honourable Philip Hammond, formerly Foreign Secretary, is now Chancellor of the Exchequer. George Osborne has left the government. Well, there's big news, and we'll have more of that a little later. Other ministerial posts will be announced as the programme continues and as the evening continues. David Cameron may well retire to the sanctuary of his countryside home for a quiet life, but will he return to a hero's welcome? How do his neighbours, the people who know him best, feel about his time in office and the legacy he leaves behind? We've been to the heart of his rural Oxfordshire constituency to hear what residents there make of the man known as Our David.
He'll come in and he'll say, hello, David, kind of thing. And he'll say, hello, James, hello, Martin. Last week, his secretary ordered a load of meat for the barbecue. And then after everything came out, we were like, that's going to be cancelled. So I phoned up yesterday and sure enough, it was cancelled. So it's just a shame because it would have been nice for us, all our meat down at Downing Street. So I was going to go down and deliver it myself. 100 burgers, 100 sausages and 100 barbecue pork ribs. But you never know, he might want it again. That's why I haven't chucked it away. So he might change his mind and want a barbecue again, but we'll wait and see.
I feel for anybody that gets kicked out of their house, and in all respect, he's getting kicked out of his house. It's very difficult to have to pack up your goods and chattels and in the public eye and come away when you've worked hard for the Queen and country for all those years. Yeah, I'm sad for them.
Practically neighbours. He's literally just across the fields across there, the village, just across the fields over there. Hello, chooks. Don't fight over it. There's more to come.
I'm a Labour man, so I can't really say too much about the Conservatives, but he's done a good job, I think. I've got a second car. I could probably employ him. You know, we can give him another car and have him whizzing around the Cotswolds.
When he first was elected, he came drinking here every now and then, but he, I think he prefers to go into the bull now. I think it's more of his theme.
As soon as he became Prime Minister, he lost his identity, I think. You know, I've been Conservative all my life, and I really started to lose, you know, the concept of what Conservatives were meant to be doing in their community.
How could he? He's got to run a country now, so he's got all the constituencies, you know.
See, I completely disagree with that because okay, he's got a bigger job to do, but he's still our politician. He shouldn't be like that.
Maybe you're right, man. Yeah, maybe you're right.
Didn't really have a legacy of anything. I can't think of a legacy he's going to leave behind that anyone's ever going to say, can you remember what David Cameron did? Because he didn't.
Yes, well, I will see you Saturday. Yes, yes. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Well, we've got just seen Philip Hammond going into the Foreign Office to say goodbye to his team in there. He's just coming in and he's going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he's going to be moving across to the Treasury. In fact, he's now moving into the Treasury this very moment because there he is going up the steps into the newly refurbished Treasury. Well, joining us now to discuss today's momentous events are the film director Ken Loach, the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, the broadcaster Kirsty Allsop, and the columnist and author Bidisha. Ken Loach, Osborne's gone.
Good.
Your reaction?
Brilliant. What good news. There's always a silver lining to every cloud, isn't there?
Fraser Nelson.
It was inevitable. He was predicting this awful gloom after Brexit. There's no way he could have stood and been the voice of reassurance and stability after the performance he laid on in the campaign. A shame, but you know, he was the one who put the stakes so high.
Kirsty Allsop, you an Osborne fan?
He's worked pretty hard for the last 6 years, probably harder than Dave has, and none of the glory, and now that's it. It's all over.
He's not tarred with quite the same brush, is he?
No, probably not.
No,
he didn't call it, and he's been able to slip away. But unlike Ken, I have to say I feel a bit sorry for him.
Bidisha?
I'm actually quite glad this final head has fallen. On the way in here, I was thinking to myself and getting really angry and thinking, God, these politicians, they're cockroaches. Osborne is going to survive. And I'm glad to see that he's gone, because to me, he was the face of inequality and punitive economic policies, and I'm glad he's out.
Is that the legacy of this particular Tory regime?
The opposite, actually. Inequality's fallen under George Osborne. We've had 2 million new jobs, with the poorest, the lowest paid have done the best under Osborne, and the highest paid have done the worst. That's been his legacy. It's a progressive legacy he and David Cameron leave behind, and it's one that Theresa May will seek to build on. It's very difficult to look at what he's actually achieved and said this was actually bad for Britain.
But that's odd, because you can't tell from what she said that she wants to build on it. She actually wants to deal with privilege, cut it down, and build up the people who are at the bottom.
That's exactly what David Cameron and George Osborne were doing. Who were free schools for? The least privileged. It was as a progressive government before, a progressive government now.
Yes, isn't it extraordinary that the number of homeless families applying for bed and breakfast and temporary accommodation is 100% increased. You've got 100,000 children called homeless. Food banks have appeared in the Osborne-Cameron era. There's a desperate inequality, desperate poverty. Homeless families. The inequality is marked by, in this city, you will see tower blocks of luxury apartments in which 80% are dark, because they're there for foreign investors who can't even vote here, while you have homeless families crammed into one room, a massive increase in rough sleeping. The inequality, the poverty, the cruelty to vulnerable people marks these people.
Kirsty?
It's interesting what Ken said about the flats. We are not allowed to say that foreigners should not come and live here. Not the rich nor the poor. And I'm afraid the flats are what we have to put up with. We cannot say that one type of person cannot be accepted into this country from abroad and that another person
The investments. They're not for living, they're investments.
They're not investments. They're the richest people in some of the most troubled countries in the world. They're the rich people from Turkey, the rich people from Jordan, the rich people from Russia.
Yeah, but why do we want their empty flats all over London?
We don't want their empty flats, and I don't want their empty flats. But there can't be one rule for the rich buying something to secure themselves and another rule for those who are poorer.
Well, then do you have any confidence that Theresa May's speech on the steps of Downing Street, pledging to tackle privilege and indeed the huge gap between rich and poor, has anything to it?
I don't know, and I'm suspicious of saying so because at the end of the day, Theresa May is a Tory Prime Minister. That is where her values lie. I think she made those comments because of something to do with the referendum, actually. She felt that she was somehow having to answer to those people who thought, hang on, this politics game, even the commentating that we're doing here, it's something that elites do in their lovely bubble in London. They don't know what it's like to have to worry about their 0 hours contracts job. They don't know what it's like to go through the town centre
Hold up
and
a
see
moment.
that all
We've
the
just had a major experience in Downing Street. Boris Johnson is Britain's Foreign Secretary. Fraser Nelson. Well, I just saw that strange turn of a head there. That was a bit of a shock, wasn't it?
It's a great appointment because somebody needs to say to the rest of the world that Britain has just voted for Brexit in an optimistic way, in a way which it looks out to embrace, to make new friends world over. Boris needs to be the person who wonderfully explained Brexit during the campaign. He can explain it now to all of the doubters, but this was a self-confident nation stretching out its hands to make new friends. That will be his job.
This is the man who got within a whisper of being Prime Minister and then fell about and decided to pull out.
Yes, he's not a very good political schemer, but he is a very good salesman, and right now he'll be a salesman for Britain PLC. What a great appointment.
I can see Badisha's face of utter horror,
but
I have to
is
say,
rushing to my feet right now.
just remember one thing, in the spirit of being kind of realistic about this. When we had the Olympics, he was brilliant. He was seen by people all over the world being a really good ambassador for London.
You've got to be joking. I mean, it's the day irony died, isn't it? When Boris Johnson... I mean, it's another old Etonian. I mean, at least they're consistent.
I'm sure he's fun to hang out with, but I wouldn't trust him with my dog, let alone the country post-referendum.
No, I think it's seriously worrying because...
But are you not reassured by the fact that he doesn't really know where he stands on Brexit? I mean, wasn't there a possibility that he didn't want to be Prime Minister because he didn't actually really entirely believe in what he'd been doing?
Well, in the end, they're a bunch of Tories, and in the end, they understand class loyalty. It's something the right wing, the Labour Party, should learn, that actually they stick together. They'll bury the hatchet, and they'll find common cause, and their common cause will be how do they best exploit the working class of this country. They thought, some of them thought they should do it in Europe, and some of them think they can do it best out of Europe.
But just
and
for a
that's
moment,
what drives them.
Isn't it quite clever to have said, right, OK, you got us into this mess, you get us out of it?
Well, it is if you think he's competent. Having seen
There
what
he
he
is
did in
leaving
London,
Downing Street. Let's take a quick look at him as you talk. Keep going, keep going.
Oh, what an encouraging start.
You are genuinely filled with optimism and hope.
Yeah, there is a reason why Boris Johnson is one of the most popular politicians in Britain. He conveys optimism and hope. He oozes optimism and hope.
But so does a clown at a children's party.
Well, you don't get many clowns having run London successfully for 8 years.
Apparently
He's proven his ability in office, and now he's about to go and sell Britain to the world. It's the best possible deployment of Boris.
I think if you were the housing crisis, you wouldn't say he'd run London successfully. There's a huge housing crisis in this city, and he is responsible.
He isn't responsible.
Badisha.
I'm really worried about this. Ever since the referendum, I've simply been referring to it as the disaster. And to see that one of the captains of this disaster, I called it, well, not even a captain, I called it sort of a runaway train towards a dead end, is now in charge of it is extremely worrying because to me it signals increasing insularity, increasing jingoism and xenophobia, England turning in on itself when we never had to do this. England did not vote for this. Around about half of the people who voted did, the other half didn't. This is not something we all want.
Is not Mrs May perhaps the clue to controlling Boris?
I think Mrs May is absolutely the clue to controlling Boris. She's a highly intelligent woman who works very hard and is, we gather, the opposite of Boris. If she feels that this is the right thing to do, then her instincts are probably correct, because she doesn't owe Boris any favours. So she wouldn't do it unless she believed that Boris could do the job. But what's interesting is, I'll admit now, I don't know the name of our shadow Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm not.
So who is that person? Does anyone know the name of the shadow Foreign Secretary?
I think the problem with the Labour Party now is the attacks by the right wing to unseat a man who was elected democratically by an overwhelming majority on a programme that not only the Labour Party has needs and wants, but the people need and want. Decent council housing, the contractors out of the NHS, and so on.
But Ken, if he can't get a member of his parliamentary Labour Party to accept the job of shadow Foreign Secretary...
We're going to have to understand where they come from. End it with that big if. And thank you all for coming in, but we're going to have to go back to Downing Street. Gary, would you just tell us what you make of what we've heard during this programme?
I wouldn't read too much into Boris Johnson being the Foreign Secretary. It's not the role it was, and it certainly isn't a major role. If there is a minister in charge of the Europe negotiations, effectively Boris Johnson would be wandering around the world in different time zones, but probably not having that much to do with Europe. I've been told that about to come down the street, possibly, are two people you might call retreads. David Davis, who never actually made it into the first Cameron government, and Liam Fox, who had to resign after a short while as Defence Secretary. And I think you see in these names some of the problems that Theresa May is going to come across. She's trying to look fresh. She's trying to emphasise that she has a social justice agenda, put together some of these names and faces, and they sound as though they're a little bit on the right of the party, none of them obviously with a massive background, I'm sure they'd quibble with this, some of them, in social justice. A lot of it's going to come down to her, and with Brexit, not much money around, and a social justice agenda, that's going to be a very big job.
Gary Gibbons, on this momentous day with a new Prime Minister and a new government emerging, we leave you with the images of the changeover of power on a quite extraordinary day.
Nothing is really impossible if you put your mind to it. After all, as I once said, I was the future once. It has been the greatest honour of my life to serve our country as Prime Minister over these last 6 years. And as we leave for the last time, my only wish is continued success for this great country that I love so very much. Thank you.
If you're just managing, I want to address you directly. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours.